Hello everyone, and welcome to Casa Nightmare. In this episode, we'll share with you 3 scary bedtime stories. So without further ado, let's get into it. An old man sat in front of the fireplace one evening, just sat and rocked, warming his feet by the fire. The fire crackled, the rocking chair creaked. Then a thing slowly rose in the flames, stepped out of the fire, and stood in front of the man. They just looked at one another, that thing and that man. Without saying a word, that thing sat down in the second rocking chair and started rocking right in time with that old man. They rocked that way for a long, long time. The fire crackled, the rocking chairs creaked. Then that thing turned to the man and grinned and said, "Nobody's sitting here rocking by the fire. Nobody rocking but us." Well, that man jumped right out of the rocking chair, ran right through the front door, lurched down the porch stairs, and raced down the road. That old man ran faster than any old man had ever run. As his bare feet slapped against the road, that old man heard something close behind him. He felt something warm on the back of his neck. He looked over his shoulder, and there was that thing, breathing its foul breath on him and running just as fast as he was. That thing grinned and said, "Nobody running down this here road. Nobody running but you and me." That man ran faster than any man, old or young, had ever run. His heart nearly pounded its way out of his chest. His lungs burned as he struggled to get away from that thing. A wall of smooth stone stood at the bend in the road. The old man fell against that wall and panted as he tried to catch his breath. He looked down the road to see if that thing was near. It was. That thing was leaning against the wall, right beside the man, with its long, dirty fingernails. That thing grinned and said, "Nobody leaning up against this here wall. Nobody leaning but you and me." That old man started to climb that wall, but the stones were too smooth. That old man slid and slipped and slid some more. And right next to him was that thing, climbing and slipping and sliding and grinning as it said, "There's nobody trying to climb this here wall. Nobody climbing but you and me." The old man quickly reached the top of the wall, a little too quickly, for he lost his grip. He slipped and fell on the other side of the wall. That thing reached the top of the wall and jumped and landed on the old man. It pushed itself up and looked that old man in the eye. It grinned and said, "There's nobody trying to climb this here wall. Nobody climbing but you and me." That's when the old man passed out. The next morning, somebody came along and saw that old man beside the wall. That somebody shook the old man until he revived and helped him up from the ground. That somebody dusted off the old man's clothes and put an arm around his shoulder. "Poor man," said that somebody. "Please, tell me, what happened to you?" That old man trembled and nearly cried. "Last night," he said, "a thing stepped out of my fireplace. It chased me out of my house, down this road, and up this wall. Then it jumped on me, and I guess I passed out." "Oh," said that somebody, "how terrible. But don't worry. You see, there's nobody here but you and me." It was the holidays and most of the kids had gone home from boarding school for a week. Some of the students, however, lived too far away, or their parents were out of the country, or someone was going to pick them up later in the week. To save electricity and heating oil, all the students from all the dorms were moved into 2 dorms temporarily, one for guys and one for gals. In the girls' dorm, 2 girls who had never met were put into a room together. They hit it off well from the first, and the sun had long set when they got back from the dining commons that night and went to their room. The older girl told the younger girl that she had seen someone in the shadows outside the dorm, and they agreed to keep the door to the room locked. Then the older girl went down the hall to take a shower. She was gone a long time, and the younger girl began to get scared. She stood with her ear against the locked door of the room, hoping to hear the older girl coming down the hall. What she heard terrified her. It was a noise like a huge snake sliding down the hall and moving slowly towards the door. Then she heard a gurgling sound like a monster blowing bubbles in the water of a lagoon. Then something began to claw at the door, scratching as if it wanted to get in. The young girl screamed. What was that thing? Some kind of huge, hideous animal that crawled like a snake and clawed at the door? The scratching went on and on. Was it some kind of maniac? What weapon did he have? Was he cutting slowly through the door? The younger girl retreated from the door into a corner away from the windows. She slid slowly down into a seated position and began to cry. The scratching, clawing sound went on and on for hours. The girl cried herself to sleep. When she woke up, it was bright outside, long after sunrise. There was no sound at all in the dorm. There was no sound at all in the hall. The younger girl walked slowly to the door. Did she dare to open it? She gently took hold of the knob with one hand. Was the monster waiting just outside, waiting for her to open the door? She took the knob of the door lock in the other hand. Was the maniac just down the hall with his weapon, waiting? Slowly she turned the lock. On the hall floor was the other girl, dead in a pool of blood. Her throat had been cut. The door was covered with scratches from her fingernails. She had been trying to get the younger girl to let her in. When Stacy was born, her mother lived just long enough to kiss her baby girl goodbye. Her heartbroken father took the newborn to his sister Mary and her husband Michael. "How can I raise a baby?" he asked. "I know nothing about babies. Please, help me." And of course they did. Baby Stacy was snuggled into the family alongside her cousins and grew up like a daughter in the house. Her father went north to find work in farm country, but he came back every weekend to see his baby girl and brought Mary and Michael money for her keep. One day, Stacy's father was driving a threshing machine, and one of the moving parts stopped working. When he went back to see what was wrong, there was an accident, and now Stacy was an orphan. Just 3 years old, Stacy was too young to understand much of this, but her aunt told her the story, cuddling the girl on her knee. Stacy wanted to hear the story again and again as she grew up. Aunt Mary always ended it the same way. "So now you're a daughter in this house and will be all your life, and that's the end of that." It was the end, Stacy thought, but she always felt odd that she couldn't remember much about what her father looked like. She'd been so young when he died, and there was no photograph, not even a wedding picture. So Stacy grew up looking after her younger cousins and helping Mary in the kitchen, playing with her schoolmates, and living on the small farm that kept the growing family supplied with food. Stacy was now the middle child in a large family, all boys except for her. Sometimes, as they cooked and cleaned and mended, Aunt Mary would reach out and rub the back of her hand on Stacy's cheek. "It's good to have a daughter in the midst of all these sons," she'd say. Without ever putting it into words, Stacy knew that was Mary's way of saying she wasn't just here to work, and that she loved her. One day when Stacy was about 14, Aunt Mary called her into the parlor. It was a frightening thing to be summoned to this cold, clean room with its good furniture, too special to use every day. The parlor was reserved for the minister and other important guests, or for a talking to from Aunt Mary before Uncle Mike took you out back to cut a switch off the birch tree. In her mind, Stacy ran through what she could have done wrong as she walked into the parlor. Aunt Mary took one look at her expression and burst out laughing. "Dearie me, don't look so scared. I only want to talk to you. Stacy, sit here." She patted the sofa beside her. When Stacy sat down, Mary took her hand and held it a moment before speaking. She didn't even look at Stacy. "Daughter of mine," said her aunt, "it's not the end of the world, but it's hard times, that's sure. Your uncle can't get to work, and I can't go myself since the twins were born. They're too young to be without me all day. But you, Stacy, you're a great, strong lass." Her aunt looked at her, and Stacy was surprised to see pleading and tears in her eyes. "We need you to go to work and bring your wages home. We'll get through this bad patch, but we need money. There's a family in one of the great houses wanting a maid. It's a bit far on the other end of town, but you can stay there during the week and come home for Saturdays. It's all arranged if you say yes, but if you don't want to go—" Aunt Mary didn't finish the sentence. She just looked at Stacy. Stacy tried to keep a grin from her face. She could see that her aunt was upset, but Stacy was excited. The city, a big house, a chance to see how other people lived. Maybe there would be a girl her own age in the house. Stacy could feel her face breaking into a smile and bit her lip hard to stop herself. Aunt Mary was a smart woman. She gave a rueful laugh and squeezed Stacy's hand. "Well, if that's the way of it, we'll have Uncle Mike take you across on Monday." She leaned over and kissed the top of Stacy's head. On Monday morning, Mike took his niece to the house, a long ride in a borrowed pony cart. Stacy carried Aunt Mary's gold-handled carpet bag. Inside it were 2 spare dresses, her nightgown, and the rag doll Aunt Mary had made for her when she was a wee girl. She'd meant to leave the rag doll home now that she was a grown woman working in town, but at the last minute she wanted it so badly, she couldn't say why, that she hid it under her nightgown in the bag. She bid her uncle a cheery goodbye and ran up the steps to the house. She didn't look back, but Stacy could hear Uncle Mike turning the cart and the slow crunch of the wheels across the drive, and she knew he was looking back at her. She gulped down the fear in her throat, straightened her back, and knocked on the big oak doors. An angry voice came from the lawn. "Here, you! Don't use the main doors. They're for your betters. Go round to the servants' entrance. What's wrong with you, country bumpkin? Are you stupid?" A man was standing at the side of the house. No, not a man, but a boy about Stacy's age, big for his age, hands on his hips, face red with anger. He stared at Stacy as she approached. His clothes were expensive, clean, and perfect. Stacy knew at once he was a son in her employer's family. She started to stammer an apology. The boy snarled, "Get away!" and swung his walking stick at her. She ducked and ran for the servants' entrance at the back. Stacy soon learned that the young man, Grady Smith, was best avoided. The cooks, the groomsmen, the butlers, and the other maid all rolled their eyes and shook their heads when his name came up. Once, sitting in the kitchen, talking to the cooks, the head butler called him an impertinent little boy. Stacy didn't know what impertinent meant, but she liked anyone calling such a self-important person a little boy, especially when he was so big. So the weeks went by. Stacy slept in a little room under the attic eaves and spent her days cleaning, sewing, sometimes even cooking. She loved the kitchen with its warm smells and welcoming smiles from the cooks and would linger there often and as long as possible. But she worked quickly in the parlor, the drawing room, and any other place where she might be caught alone by Grady, who would as soon slap a servant as say good morning to her. And every weekend, Mary went home. One day, when they were baking bread together and Stacy had her sleeves pushed up to work through the dough, her aunt noticed a bruise on Stacy's arm. "How did you come by that, dearie?" Embarrassed, Stacy pulled her sleeve down. "Oh, clumsy me," she said. She knew her aunt and uncle were feeding the family with the money she brought home now that winter had set in. She wasn't going to complain or tell her aunt how Grady liked to wait at hall corners to jump out and scare her so badly she would upset the mop pail, how he would run away laughing, leaving her to clean up the mess, or how he snuck behind her as she started the morning fire in the great downstairs fireplace and yelled so that she jumped up and hit her head on the stones. No, there was no point in saying anything about awful young Grady. Stacy was clever enough to avoid him most of the time, and tough enough to accept what came her way when she couldn't. One night, Stacy stumbled to her bed later than usual. One of the cooks was sick, and she'd been lending a hand in the kitchen. Bone weary, she didn't see a shadow move in the hallway. Out stepped Grady and gave her a shove. She fell into the railing of the staircase, smacking her ribs so the breath flew out of her. "Sneaking round in the night, trying to steal something, no doubt," he snarled. Stacy's patience snapped. "Let poor honest working folk get to bed, you great overgrown bully. For shame, master to be in this house, and not the manners of a schoolboy. Uncle Mike would whip you till you couldn't stand." Grady's eyes widened. His face grew dark. "You can't talk to me like that," he shrieked and launched himself at her. She was against the stair railing, and as he came to her, Stacy knew two things. She couldn't fall, and she couldn't let him fall, no matter how badly she wanted to. Whoever fell would be killed. She was a great strong girl. Her aunt had said so. Planting her feet, Stacy held onto the rail as he slammed into her, grabbed him by his nightshirt as he teetered, and held him upright. Swaying but not falling, she pushed him. Hard. He landed safely on the hall floor, sliding on his backside across the polished surface into the wall. In fury, he leapt up and tackled her again, this time grabbing her arm as if to wrench it from the railing. Stacy felt a sharp burning encircle her elbow. She gasped. She'd never felt pain like that before. They both heard the sharp crack at the same moment. He let her go, but it was too late. Stacy grabbed at her arm, wincing as she touched it, reeling sideways to avoid the stairs. Grady stood wide-eyed a moment, then turned and ran yelling. "Thief!" Her arm throbbing, her head muddled with pain, Stacy didn't think. She just moved. Down the staircase she ran, cradling her arm against her side with her other hand. The great oak doors were closed and barred, but there was no stopping her. The beam that barred the door, which required two men to put in place, she flipped up with one mighty thrust and barreled through the doorway. She fled into the snowy night as the cries of the waking household faded behind her. She was running like a frightened animal, away from that house, away from that boy, toward home. But home was a long way away, and it was dark and cold and snowing. Stacy was wearing only her maid's uniform, and now her arm throbbed so badly she could hardly draw breath. She looked around. Nothing was familiar. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Stacy realized she was lost. "What do I do now?" She spoke into the empty air, but from the darkness a voice answered. "And what is it you want to do, young Stacy?" In a whisper that was half whimper, she said, "I want to go home." "Then home it is," said the man, appearing at her side. He was stocky, not much taller than she was. His black hair shot through with gray. He held out a hand to her, then drew back. "I do not like the look of that arm. Let me see." Shaking from cold and fear, Stacy stood silent, but when the man touched her arm, she winced. He said. "This will hurt, but then it will feel better." He touched her arm again, and it burned, then stopped. Her arm still throbbed, but it was a dull ache, not the sharp pain of before. "Now, let's get you home to Aunt Mary, young lady." He held out his hand and she took it. There was nothing left to say or do. She was cold, she was tired, and she wanted to go home. They walked and he talked, asking Stacy about the school at her aunt's village and what Stacy learned there. but he never asked her about the big house or why she was standing in the snow with a broken arm. In the early light of dawn, she swayed on her feet and started to fall. She didn't react when the man picked her up like a rag doll and carried her the rest of the way to Aunt Mary's, laying her down in the doorway. Such a fuss was made. The whole household got up, the little cousins dancing around, bringing blankets and warm clothes. Mary dressed Stacy in a dry flannel nightgown and got some hot tea down her while the young ones pulled woolen socks over her feet. Sitting on the floor in front of the fire, Mary tucked Stacy into the quilts and rocked her in her arms until she fell asleep, safe and warm. It was late in the morning when Stacy awoke in her aunt and uncle's bed. The first thing she saw was her aunt sitting in a chair by the bed, smiling at her. Stacy smiled back. Aunt Mary spoke. "Well now, Mr. Smith's been around with your bag and 2 months' wages." Her mouth set in a hard line. "Seems to think there's been a misunderstanding and doesn't want to get the police involved." She shook her head, then smiled at Stacy again. "So, you'll not go back to that place. Just you lie there, and I'll fetch you some tea." Aunt Mary brought 2 mugs, then settled into the chair. "Now, start at the beginning and tell me everything." So Stacy started with the boy on the lawn, talked through the cooks in the kitchen and Grady breaking her arm, and finished with the man who saved her from freezing to death. Mary looked angry, then confused, and finally concerned. "Stacy, love, you've had a rough time. Your arm's got a bruise the size of a horse's hoof, but the bone's not broken, and no one brought you home. There were only your footprints in the snow, and we found you crumpled like a rag doll in the doorway. It broke my heart seeing you like that. You walked here alone. It was a snow dream you were having." Stacy shook her head. "No, he was real. He was just as tall as me, and his hair was black and white, and when he touched my arm, it stopped burning." Aunt Mary looked at Stacy, a strange expression on her face. "Tell me, did this man have anything here?" She pointed to the side of her cheek. Closing her eyes, Stacy concentrated, remembering a scar, almost to his chin, like a half circle. At that, Aunt Mary sat back. "Oh, that's the way of it," she said as if to herself. "No doubt your arm was broken, and he fixed it." She turned her attention back to Stacy and gave a swift smile. "The man who brought you home, dearie, he was your father."